Welcome to Geek Cross, the podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. And in each episode on Geek Cross, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy, gaming, or comic books as a jumping off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. On this episode of Geek Cross, we're looking at a film that's been in the news a lot over the last several months. Not because the film is any good, but because of the situation, the news, the environment surrounding the film. The film, of course, is The Interview, featuring Seth Rogen and James Franco as newsmen who go to North Korea with the mission to assassinate the leader Kim Jung-Un. Now, the story behind The Interview, the news has been that in November 2014, Columbia's parent company, Sony Pictures Entertainment, was hacked by a group identifying themselves as Guardians of Peace. North Korea, of course, denied involvement, but everybody suspects them. The film was then pulled from wide distribution due to concerns by theater owners of terrorism. Now, since the film has just been released on Netflix and is being streamed in a number of different places, I think it's fair to warn you of spoilers. I will be talking about plot points and giving away things that happen, so you have been warned. Spoilers, spoilers, spoilers. The plot of The Interview, the film features James Franco as Dave Skylark, who is an entertainment journalist with one of those flashy evening entertainment shows, and Seth Rogen as Aaron Rappaport, who is his producer, who is a producer that dreams of doing some serious news. He had gone to Columbia, he had been a journalism student, and part of him feels like he's slumming it doing this entertainment news. Well, it turns out that the dictator, the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jung-Un, is a big fan of the show. And so this Dave Skylark manages to get an interview with him, and so he and Aaron fly to North Korea to interview this leader. Before they leave for North Korea, Dave and Aaron are approached by the CIA, which asks them to assassinate the North Korean president. And that's basically the plot of the movie. Dave and Aaron travel to North Korea. They have lots of adventures. They fight. They make up. Dave gets to know Kim Jung-Un on a personal level. The interview happens, and so on, and hijinks ensue. It's, of course, your typical sort of Seth Rogen comedy, where there's lots of kind of offensive humor. The film makes great hay. In the official biography of Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, that he did not pee or poop. And so there are lots of poop jokes. There's lots of sex jokes. It's that kind of gross sort of humor. And that has a place. That kind of gross humor, fart jokes, poop jokes, sex jokes, has a place in comedy. The question is, does it work in context for The Interview? Does it work in the context of North Korea and the political situation? Because the film is about assassinating a foreign leader, it immediately takes on a political context. And the question is, does the film work? I'll get to that answer a little bit later on. But one of the things that's been interesting in the conversation about The Interview is that the film is often compared to The Great Dictator, which is Charlie Chaplin's classic 1940 satire of Adolf Hitler. For example, in protest of Sony's cancellation, some theaters showed The Great Dictator. Now, in The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin plays both Adenoid Hinkle, who is the dictator of Tomania, and a Jewish barber, his tramp character, who fought in the Great War for Tomania and was injured and has suffered from amnesia and does not realize when he leaves the hospital that things have changed. Tomania, of course, is a stand-in for Germany, And Adenoid Hinkel is, of course, a stand-in for Adolf Hitler. And so this comedy from 1940, at the very beginning of World War II, the film depicts the harassment of Jews by stormtroopers who come into the ghetto, who cause havoc, who upset and interfere with business. It depicts the purging of the Jewish ghetto. This is comedy. This is dark comedy. The film depicts the purging of the Jewish ghetto, while at the same time being a slapstick comedy typical of Charlie Chaplin. The Great Dictator also has some classic scenes of satire. For example, at one point Chaplin makes fun of Hitler's propaganda speeches. He depicts Hinkel gleefully bouncing a globe in his offices, as if he has the world in his hands. And of course, finally, there is the famous speech by the barber who is mistaken for Hinkel, who goes up and he makes a speech calling for unity, freedom, and goodwill between nations. There are no poop jokes, but there are plenty of times when the stormtroopers are hit in the head with frying pans. So lots of frying pan jokes. The question that these two films raise when we look at them together is, how do we handle comedy about dictatorships and tyrants? How do we handle comedy that deals with human evil, that deals with persecution, that deals with the horrors that often happen in life? How do we make what is grossly unfunny funny? And what are the politics behind it? Now, not all films like this work. There is this well-known example. Well, I'm not sure if it's a well-known example. It's sort of the standard of poor decision-making on filmmaking. There's a film that was made in 1972 called The Day the Clown Cried, featuring Jerry Lewis. And what the film is about is a clown, a German clown, who's been imprisoned in a concentration camp during World War II. Needless to say, this film has never been actually officially released. It's a bit of an urban legend. One of the reasons perhaps why this film was never released is that it portrays the clown entertaining and leading Jewish children to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. This ultimately was in poor taste, and the film has never seen the light of day. But there are other examples, other than The Great Dictator and Charlie Chaplin, where Hitler has been successfully made fun of and satired and parodied. One of the other great comedians who has done this repeatedly, several times, of course, is Mel Brooks. And Mel Brooks, of course, is best known for The Producers, a film from 1968, in which two individuals try to create this scam by making the worst Broadway play ever. And what they end up doing is they end up doing a musical about Hitler, and there's this huge, massive musical number where this huge cast of goose-stepping cast saying Springtime for Hitler and Germany. And of course, this musical, is so inappropriate, but it ends up being a huge hit because people perceive it to be a comedy. Mel Brooks has also portrayed Hitler a number of times, and one example would be, the best known example would be the film To Be or Not to Be from 1983. This film is about a Polish theater troupe in Warsaw during the German invasion in 1939. And connected with the movie is a music video called The Hitler Rap, in which Mel Brooks is dressed up as Hitler, and he raps about being Hitler and being a dictator of Germany, while backup singers seductively sing Sieg Heil. Why does Mel Brooks do this? Well, in an interview with Salon in 2012, Mel Brooks says that when it comes to Hitler, he uses comedy as a weapon. Quote, "After all the people that he was responsible for killing and utterly destroying half the world, I just thought that the only weapon I have is comedy. And if I could make this guy ludicrous, if I could make people laugh at him, then it's a victory of sorts. But for even Mel Brooks, there are limits to this weapon. There are places where this kind of comedy is inappropriate. Mel Brooks, for example, does not like the Roberto Benigni film Life is Beautiful. In a 2006 interview with Der Spiegel, Brooks says that he was annoyed with the film. He was annoyed that the film attempted to find comedy in a concentration camp. And he objected to the film's philosophy that people can get over anything. That people can struggle with the worst circumstances and they can get over it and survive. Because Brooks said, no, they can't. They can't get over a concentration camp, unquote. Mel Brooks went on to say, quote, I always ask myself, tell me, Roberto, are you nuts? You didn't lose any relatives in the Holocaust. You're not even Jewish. You really don't understand what it's all about. The Americans were incredibly thrilled to discover from him that it wasn't all that bad in the concentration camps after all. And that's why they immediately pressed an Oscar in his hand, unquote. For Mel Brooks, there's a need, when you do comedy about Hitler, to separate Hitler from the Holocaust. There's something that one can lampoon the person, the individual Hitler, but one runs the risk of trivializing horror, of trivializing suffer, when you lampoon the suffering. Years later, after making The Great Dictator, Charlie Chaplin himself noted in his autobiography that if he had known the extent of the Nazi atrocities against the Jews, he would not have made The Great Dictator. And this is a really difficult question, and I think this is a very sensitive question. What kinds of comedy, at what point is it inappropriate to make comedy about suffering, to make that kind of dark, black comedy? There's been a lot of discussion in the last month since the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris, the French satirical magazine, which was attacked and targeted by Muslim extremists for their satirical artwork on the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, the answer that we often say when we look at these kinds of questions is that, art should be unfettered, that there should be no censorship, that freedom of speech matters over everything else. There was an interesting response in the New York Times by Ahmed Saladin, who is a science fiction and fantasy writer. And he notes that when it comes to satire and when it comes to parody, we often have a tendency to self-censorship ourselves anyway, that we select our targets based on our worldview and individual experience, that who we are often determines who we target. So in response to the statement that comedy, that parody, that satire should target everyone, he writes, quote, the question for writers and artists is not whether we ought to limit ourselves, but how we limit ourselves. In a field dominated by privileged voices, it's not enough to say, mock everyone. In an unequal world, satire that mocks everyone equally ends up serving the powerful, unquote. So just like Mel Brooks, Saladin understands that comedy can be a weapon, but he asks the question, who should use that weapon? Who gets to use that weapon? Because if everyone is mocked, it ends up serving often the powerful interests. It takes the politics, it takes the bite, it takes the meaning out of satire. I think partly of what makes this problematic, of why Charlie Chaplin and Mel Brooks can make fun of Hitler, but James Franco and Seth Rogen cannot make fun of Kim Jung-Un. I think the answer to the question of why Charlie Chaplin and Mel Brooks could make fun out of Hitler, but Seth Rogen can't make fun of Kim Jong-un, has to do with this question of power and speech. Now, neither Charlie Chaplin nor Mel Brooks were victims in the Holocaust, But they had relatives. They had families that died. They are Jews. And in lampooning Hitler and mocking Hitler, they are using comedy as a weapon of the victims, of the powerless, to go after the powerful. James Franco and Seth Rogen, of course, are not North Koreans. They are not Kim Jung-Un's victims. And while North Korea is a terrible place, it is also not Nazi Germany. It is a place, it's a country that has been isolated ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is a country that can barely feed its own people. It's a country that really isn't a threat to the United States. And so it's easy and safe. And so it makes an easy and safe target to mock. The interview, probably unintentionally, invokes that people of color have often been used as cartoon villains in Hollywood action movies. For example, North Korea was recently, in the last couple of years, used as the villain in the Red Dawn remake. Now, of course, originally that was the Chinese. The Chinese were invading America, but then the studio realized that China was a huge market, and they changed it to North Korea. Of course, one's identity does not have to be directly tied to the victims of a particular tyrant, but one has to be careful. An excellent example of how this is handled would be Quentin Tarantino's film *Inglourious Basterds*, which portrays Hitler and the top brass of the Third Reich as entitled children. And the reason why it works there, this portrayal, this lampooning, this mocking of Hitler, is that the film is also incredibly self-conscious in a postmodern way of the Holocaust, of pre-war German film, of exploitation films, and spaghetti westerns. In some ways, *Inglourious Basterds* is a Jewish revenge film for the Holocaust, without ever directly mentioning the Holocaust. Part of the problem also has to do with distance. There's been enough distance with Hitler and the Third Reich that Quentin Tarantino can make a film as a non-Jew. There's been enough distance since World War II that Quentin Tarantino, who is not Jewish, can make a Jewish revenge film. There is not that same distance when it comes to North Korea. Chris Taylor on Mashable notes that previous films that have dealt with dictatorships and tyrants have used comedic distance. Chaplain in The Great Dictator didn't depict Adolf Hitler directly. He played a character named Adenoid Hinkle, and he used absurd caricature of Hitler to cut him down to size. Team America World Police did the same thing, in which Kim Jong-Un's father, Kim Jong-il, was a puppet, rather than being depicted as a real person. Taylor notes what makes the interview different is that it depicts a current living dictator and then brutally and graphically kills him in an explosion. And the question here is, this is of course very provocative. It is very provocative to take a current leader and depict his assassination. But is it funny? Taylor argues by using caricatures, by using comedic distance, it helped the comedy. It helped make these horrible real-life people funny. But in a situation where a real person is depicted being murdered, is that still funny? Part of the problem is that the interview uses a current real-life brutal dictatorship as the background for what really is a bromance road picture. The film really isn't about North Korea. The film really isn't about the situation there. It's not really trying to make a political statement about Kim Jung-Un. In this film, North Korea is just an exotic setting for Rogen's and Franco's man-children characters to run around and cause havoc and have fights and make up and to renew their friendship. The film is really about them. It's not really about North Korea. I think we're in an era right now where we're becoming increasingly concerned about representation. How do we depict people of color? How do we talk about their stories? How aware are we of the role that power has in the depiction of non-white people? Now, some people, of course, dismiss all of this as political correctness. But I think these are really interesting questions, and I think they need to be explored. And I think if storytelling really has an empathetic side to it, if it's really to understand the world around us, we have to do a better job at depicting the stories of those without power and without voice. I think much more interesting than an American film about North Korea would be a Korean comedy, a Korean satire about North Korea. In the end, I thought there were parts of it that were actually quite funny and quite interesting. And the film occasionally makes statements, political statements, that I think are provocative and interesting. But overall, I think it is a deeply problematic movie. It is a movie that treads into territory it doesn't really understand. It's a movie that seeks to make fun, to lampoon, to make a political statement about a situation it really doesn't know much about. And it's a film that ultimately I don't think is really that funny. And perhaps that's the worst part about comedies. Comedy has to be funny. If it's not funny, it just doesn't work. I think in a lot of ways, the interview has taken on more significance than it deserves because of the Sony computer hacks. Comedy is a weapon. Comedy can be a way for the powerless to take on the powerful. And like any kind of weapon, it needs to be used with care. One has to be careful, one has to be sensitive, one has to know what one is aiming at. So what do you think? Did you like the interview? Do you think it's okay for Seth Rogen to make a comedy about assassinating Kim Jung-Un? Do you think free speech is more important than being sensitive about power? Love to hear your thoughts. If you like Geek Cross, please help us out and leave us a review on iTunes. You can also find Geek Cross on Facebook and Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. You can email us, answer that question I just asked, at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. Geek Cross is a McLaren production. My name is Jeremy Yoder. Thanks for listening.